It was about 2 weeks ago that someone had asked me to do a message about a prodigal spouse. And I remember there was a comment about, I've given up on this thing about prodigal spouse because they're people. They're waiting on someone they're calling a prodigal spouse, but that person's truly not his or her spouse. It could be a deception of his or her own heart or from the enemy. So what is a prodigal spouse? Well, there are different types. Jesus told a story in Luke 15 verses 11 through 32 about the prodigal son. And prodigal son, a man had two sons. The younger asked for the inheritance. The father actually divided his things and gave it to both sons. But the younger son took his stuff, left, and squandered his substance. And then after a while, when in a position of servitude, working in someone else's pigsty, he said he was better off being at his father's house. So he returned with the hope of not being treated as a son, but to be a servant in his father's house. But his father embraced him and threw a feast for him. So that's the prodigal son in a nutshell. And while I was saying that, I was reminded of the story of Hosea. That is an example of a prodigal spouse. In Hosea 1, the Lord told him, the prophet, to go marry a promiscuous woman, and he took Gomer as his wife. They had children, but then Gomer went off to be with someone else. And even she was like, I was better off with my husband. And then the Lord told Hosea to go redeem his wife, a woman beloved by another. And he paid the price for her to redeem her, and told her about she being faithful to him, and he'll be faithful to her. So while Gomer was away from the house, she was a prodigal spouse. The Bible doesn't say that Gomer divorced Hosea. In fact, when you look under the Mosaic law in Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4, it speaks about a man divorcing a woman, which begs the question, could a woman divorce a man? But in the story, Gomer left Hosea in her wayward ways, her promiscuous ways, to go be with another man. The Bible doesn't say that they were divorced, which meant the time that she was gone, she was a quote-unquote prodigal. While I'm saying that, another example the Lord brought to my recollection in Judges 19. A Levite had a concubine. The concubine fled, but she went to her father's house. A concubine is a wife, but of a lesser degree. Kind of like kings would have a queen and many concubines. But even those who weren't kings would also have concubines, such as Jacob. More on that later. So the concubine left her husband to be with her father. And it's not like her father was sick, the Bible doesn't say that. And the man went to his father-in-law's house to go get his wife. Now tragically, she ended up dying, causing a war. But the time that his concubine had left, she was a prodigal, and he went to go get her. So it does happen. But the question the person was posing wasn't really about having a spouse who leaves, but that's an example of a prodigal. Another example is not a spouse who leaves based on his or her free will, own volition, or some kind of seduction. Sometimes a prodigal is taken. Sarah could be considered a prodigal in Genesis 12, when the Pharaoh of Egypt took her into his harem. Same thing again in Genesis 20, when King Abimelech of Gerar took Sarah into his harem. During those times of her absence, but with these things, it wasn't her willingly being, or her willingly going, it was her being taken. That is an example of prodigal. Not one who leaves on his or her free will, but one who is taken against his or her will. It's not like Sarai, as she was named then. wanting to be with the Pharaoh of Egypt. It's not like Sarah wanting to be with King Abimelech of Gerar, especially since in Genesis 17, or Genesis 18, well, Genesis 17, the Lord had told Abram, then named Abraham, that he was going to bless him with a child, the promised child after a 24-year wait, and to call his name Isaac. And then in Genesis 18, the Lord also told Sarah that by this time next year, the appointed time, he would visit her and bless her with a son. So it was the wrong time for her to run off. But again, she didn't run off. She was taken by King Abimelech of Gerar. So the time that she was gone, she was a prodigal. But in Genesis 20, the Lord confronted King Abimelech and told him to return a man's wife. Or basically, he's as good as a dead man. And he returned the man's wife. But again, while she was gone, she was a prodigal. Now those examples, they were already married. She was taken against her will. Then there's also this in Genesis 29, because this is one of the things many people want to get at. How about if the Lord reveals someone as your spouse and then the person runs off? A couple of things. Jonah. When the Lord told Jonah to go to Nineveh to preach, he knew what the Lord's will was, but he ran off. He should have gone to the east, but he went to the west. Rather than going to Nineveh, he tried fleeing to Tarshish. So while he was out of the Lord's will, that he knew, he was a prodigal. And yes, for some people, because I've heard cases where two people were told, and sometimes two people heard at the same time, while face to face with a person, this is your spouse. And maybe both people heard at the same time, and yet one person went off and did something else, contrary to what God had said. But in many times in the Bible, the Lord spoke. It says, starting in Genesis 3, Eve and Adam knew not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The Lord told them that. But then the devil came along. Did God really say? Start causing doubt. And that caused Eve to do something contrary to God's word, his will, and his way. So sometimes people, they doubt what God has said because the enemy will come along and say, did God really say? Then there's also this, where the enemy will come and try to present someone who, on the surface, in a moment of time, may seem better than a person God had chosen. Or I should even say, has chosen. One of the things we can learn from the story of Jesus, after he was crucified, the members of the clergy didn't like what was written and placed above Jesus' head. They wanted to read, he said he was the king of the Jews. But Pilate said, what I have written, I have written. That is also how the word of God will not return unto him void. So if he says, if you legitimately told a person, so-and-so is going to be your spouse, God does not want to change his mind. So if he said it, that is what he plans on doing. I don't want to get into a long tangent, but there are limited reasons why the Lord would say something and not do it. But in those cases, he will oftentimes state things up front. In 1 Kings 3, the Lord spoke to Solomon, and he told him, if you will walk in my ways and keep my statutes and my commandments, as David your father did, I will do this. So the Lord put the conditions up front, where if a person fails to meet those conditions, and be like, okay, deal's off. Or the deal's not necessarily off, but I'm going to do some things to discipline you before bringing things back into alignment. So be careful about the enemy coming with someone. And the way the enemy will try to do that at times, he may come with someone from your past. Maybe someone you had a crush on, maybe the person wasn't paying you any attention back then. But suddenly this person, who is a person in your dreams, coming up. That's one way the enemy tries to detract. The enemy may also try to point out flaws in the person the Lord has ordained for you, and come with someone who is similar but doesn't have those quote unquote apparent flaws. So there are different ways the enemy can distract a person. And again, one of the common things, did God really say? In Matthew 3, the Father had said that, "This my Son in whom I'm well pleased." And shortly after, we see in Matthew 4, the devil approaching Jesus and saying, "If you're the Son of God, do this or that." You think the devil didn't know that God spoke from heaven about his Son? So he was trying to cause doubt. And that's one of the things the enemy try to use, to cause one's spouse to become a prodigal. And while I'm still speaking, I could say this like towards the end, but while I'm still speaking, if you are in a position where a person you were in a relationship with, to include a marriage, and you know it's a person the Lord has ordained for you, you're kind of like in Judges 6, where Gideon, he asked the Lord certain questions based on the fleece, offering or the sacrifice. But then in Judges 7, the Lord told Gideon to go down to the Midianite Amalekite camp, and he was going to show him something. And one man had a dream about a barley loaf rolling through the camp, and then provided interpretation, or some provided interpretation, saying it's Gideon, and the Lord has given a victory in his hands. And that gave him the confidence that everything that happened before was of the Lord, and he was going to do what he said. See, if you've been through that, and you know the person the Lord has pointed out for you, the enemy will try all kinds of things. Now, you may not fall for it, but the person the Lord has ordained for you may fall for it. So duly noted. So there are times a person is lured away by his or her lust. The enemy tries to bring someone up from the past, try to bring someone up who is close to the one the Lord has promised you, but is not the one. And it's the devil's bait. Don't go for it. So you may have to wait. And while you're waiting, the person you're supposed to be with is effectively a prodigal spouse. As mentioned before, some prodigal spouses, as we use in the term, are those, maybe a person married, and they left. And maybe the marriage ended in divorce. Maybe they're just separated and the person has moved on. So there are different levels of being what could be called a prodigal. But then there's also this, because I mentioned there are times when people know, I'm supposed to marry so-and-so is supposed to marry me. And things don't work out. An example of that, Genesis 29. Jacob made a covenant with Laban to marry his younger daughter Rachel. Who do you think, in the proximity for those 7 years, didn't know that Jacob was engaged to Rachel? But on the night when Jacob was supposed to marry Rachel, Laban, who's like a symbol of the devil, put Leah in Rachel's place instead. Some people have experienced that, where you knew the person the Lord has chosen for you, and that person knew also, but then someone else came along and messed things up. And maybe the prodigal even married someone else. And for some people, this would may be like, all hope is lost. I mentioned about Sarah earlier. She had given up on the prospect, the possibility of having a child. She was too old. She would just deal with the Ishmael situation through Hagar. She had given up to the point where the Lord mentioned about, or told her, or said that she was going to have a child within a year. She laughed. In Genesis 17, Abraham also laughed, because like they'd both given up on children. And one of the fun thing is, with Abraham, after Sarah died, he went on and had 6 more sons with a woman named Keturah. So his baby making days were not done. Part of the reason why he lived so long. So a great example of prodigal, where two people knew they were supposed to get married, and something happened to disrupt the plan. But in that case, when Jacob woke up to the truth, so there's some deception, there's some lies. And people may not like it when I use the term witchcraft to describe what happened when Jacob ended up marrying Leah. And he didn't even love her. In the King James Version of the Bible, towards the end of Genesis 29, it lets us know that Jacob hated her. Yet he remained married to her. Now in that case, back in those times, the marriage was not terminated. But a week later, Jacob had the opportunity to marry the woman he had made a covenant to marry, which is what could be described if the Lord tells you, so and so is your spouse. The word of God becomes effectively a covenant, his promise to you. This is what I'm going to do for you, my son, my daughter. And for some people, they may be supporting someone. Oh yeah, I know, yeah. The Lord revealed to me too that you're supposed to marry a person. And if something happens, maybe the person goes off to be in a relationship with someone else, then the individuals who may have supported you in times past, they may be like, well, I guess it wasn't God. But if it was God, he's going to do what needs to be done in order to bring his plans to pass. But the person who becomes a prodigal is going to learn some lessons. The person who becomes a prodigal is going to learn some lessons. The prodigal son, he got to a point where he was destitute. And the father didn't have to pray against him, but he got to a point where he was destitute. And he was realized that he was better off where he was before. Now the story of the prodigal son, yes, it ends at a certain point, but it's pretty safe to say that the prodigal son was not going to have the itch, if you will, to try to leave his father's house, especially before time. And scripture also tells us, an inheritance claimed too soon will not be blessed in the end. And not to say that the Lord ordained, maybe a person he ordained for you, to go through some mess with someone else who teaches that person that, you know what, if God says something, that's what he means. If God says something, if God ordained someone for you, then there's no one better on this earth for you, because that's one God has chosen. And the person will learn lessons. The person will get humbled. The person will get crushed. And again, you do not have to pray against a person. And even if the person ends up marrying someone, you do not have to pray against that marriage. And if it was the word of God, God is going to watch over his words, and he's going to bring it to pass. So in the story of Jacob and Rachel, and the way he ended up marrying Leah first, it was against his will. Even though to some onlookers, it may have looked as if Jacob was willing. And some could even say, but you slept with her. Jacob didn't know who he was sleeping with that night when they got married. So that's an example of a prodigal spouse. Two people who knew they were supposed to get married, yet Jacob ended up marrying someone else. And until the day he and Rachel got married, in a sense, he was a prodigal spouse. And there was no doubt that they had made a covenant 7 years earlier, in a sense through Laban, to get married. And some people are dealing with that. You know the Lord said so-and-so was supposed to be your spouse. But that person ended up becoming a prodigal. And that person is learning some harsh lessons with someone else. Then there's also this, a person who the Lord may have revealed, well, the Lord has revealed to that person that he has chosen you to be his or her spouse. But a person's like Jonah. The person knows about you, but then the person goes off with someone else. But in the story of Jonah, no matter who tried to protect him, the men tried to row in the boat or the ship, but it was the Lord who sent the storm to break up the ship. You may have heard me use the term about relationship, how you relate on a ship. So relationship. So those men, no matter what they're trying to do, Jonah was outside the Lord's will, and he was going to break up their ship, or if you will, their relationship. And then when he inquired, they finally got to a point where Jonah said, throw me overboard. Because no matter what the men did, it was the storm the Lord sent to break up their ship. And Jonah told him to throw him overboard. But even the story lets us know the Lord had prepared a fish or a whale to swallow up Jonah. And it was Jonah who cried out to the Lord to get him, in a sense, from the pits of Sheol. And when Jonah was brought back to the surface, you know what the Lord told him. The same thing he told him before. Go to Nineveh to preach. But this time around, Jonah was not going to go to the prodigal route. Jonah, in a sense, hightailed it to Nineveh, and he went through the city over a period of 3 days, he preached to the city. So the second time around, when the Lord told him to do what he needed to do, Jonah, after learning some hard lessons, was not going to try to be a prodigal again. He wasn't going to try to disobey the word of the Lord, and he complied. So for a while, Jonah was a prodigal. So yes, sometimes a person knows who he or she is supposed to marry and tries doing the opposite or something contrary to God's will. Typically, it will not go well for the person. Anyone who knows what the Lord wants him or her to do and does not do it is in trouble with the Lord. And it's like one of the worst things the Lord can do is just let a person go and not do anything, not say anything. In the story of King Saul, I'm going to get to him here also in a few. In the story of King Saul, the Lord sent Samuel to rebuke Saul. But in 1 Samuel 16, verse 1, the Lord said to Samuel, I'm paraphrasing, how long will you mourn over Saul, seeing that I've rejected him as king? It got to the point where the Lord was finished with Saul. He still allowed him to be king. But in 1 Samuel 28, a battle with Philistines was on the horizon. Saul, the Lord didn't speak to him via dreams, prophets, or Urim. So the Lord had finished communicating with him. That's when he went to go see the witch of Endor. It is one of the worst things the Lord can do when he stops communicating with a person. Saul knew what the Lord's will was, but didn't fully obey. Now with Saul, he was a reluctant king. In 1 Samuel 9, we see Saul going to search for his father's donkeys. That's when he had an encounter with Samuel the seer. And the Lord had spoken with Samuel, then according to the events in 1 Samuel 8, that he was going to appoint a king per the request of the Israelites. And the Lord chose Saul. So in 1 Samuel 9, him going to seek his father's donkeys, it was just a way for the Lord to get him to position for his inheritance. So he ended up seeing Samuel. And in 1 Samuel 10, Samuel anointed him privately as a king over Israel. Samuel gave one of the most detailed prophecies in the Bible about things that are going to occur that day. And those things did. But Samuel told Saul he was going to be there in 7 days for his public coronation. So Saul knew he was going to be king. And when his father asked him about what happened with Saul, or what happened to Samuel, he didn't say anything about the prophecy that he would become king. He didn't say anything about it. To show how much of a reluctant king Saul was. Saul knew the Lord's will. There was no doubt about it. Samuel told him, anointed him as king, which is similar to how Elisha in 2 Kings 9 had one of the servants of the prophets, or a young prophet, go go anoint Jehu as king. And it was done privately. Now initially Jehu was trying to say something else. But once Jehu made the announcement to his fellow captains, they made a proclamation about Jehu being king. So Jehu wasn't a reluctant king. He went forth and did what the Lord wanted him to do, to bring judgment upon the house of Ahab. But Saul was a reluctant king. Because in 1 Samuel 10, and I'll read from verse 20. Thus Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, and the tribe of Benjamin was taken by Lot. Then he brought the tribe of Benjamin near by its families, and Matrite. And the Matrite family was taken, and Saul the son of Kish was taken. But when they looked for him, he could not be found. Why? How could they find Saul? He knew he was going to be king, and the casting of lots was a mere formality. He knew. Samuel had a reputation that everything he said came to pass. So Saul could have just been there relaxing, knowing that, yeah, the Matrite family, Kish, or Benjamin, the Matrite family, my father Kish, and it's going to come to me. He could have the assurance. So where was he? He knew he was going to be king. He knew what the Lord's will for his life was. So, but they could not find him. In verse 22, therefore they inquired further of the Lord, has the man come here yet? So the Lord said, behold, he is hiding himself by the baggage. Why would he be hiding? He knew what the Lord's will was. And likewise, there's some people, they know who they're supposed to be with, who the Lord wants them to marry. Or they start getting these inclinations. It's like, there's something about this person. It's kind of like, I feel a pull towards this person, and we'd be afraid to act on it. And it's coming from the Lord, or in some cases, people know the person they're supposed to marry, but they're hiding, which would make them a quote unquote prodigal. And continuing, so they ran and took him. By the way, everyone was looking for him, where the Lord said he's among the baggage. The King James Version said he's among the stuff. So for some people, you know who the person the Lord has called you to marry. And in a lot of ways, you are willing and able. But the other person, in a sense, may be playing games with the Lord. But if they want to go to Jonah route, they can go to the Jonah route. And not that the Lord would have to do this. In fact, I had a brief conversation with someone yesterday. And I mentioned about how the Lord called me to serve him. And on the third time when I knew, yes, it was the Lord. And no, he had made a mistake by calling me. My answer to the Lord was yes. And I'm not sure if I was really familiar with it at the time. But upon reading Exodus 4, in Exodus 3, the Lord called Moses to serve him. Moses was reluctant to go to Egypt. Moses finally said yes to the Lord. He was going to go. But the angel of the Lord met Moses to resist him, to kill him. Because of all the times the Lord is telling him to go. Well, he was making excuses. I'm slow of speech, this or that. The Lord had had enough. So I knew, after the third time, there was no doubt who was calling me. And I knew he hadn't made a mistake. So after the third time, my answer was yes. In Hebrews 5:8, it's a messianic prophecy speaking about Jesus, even though Jesus had come and gone already. But in Hebrews 5:8, it speaks about Jesus. But even though a son, he learned obedience through the things that he suffered. Hebrews 12 speaks about not falling prey to the sins that used to easily beset us. But it speaks about the Father, the Heavenly Father, chastising each of us that he accepts as sons or daughters, and about how to discipline. It may be painful, it's uncomfortable, but it's worth it in the end. the Lord will also discipline his children. And it's not the Lord's going to try to force two people to be in a relationship when one person is going to do it. The Lord knows how to change people's hearts. And even here recently, there's a color that's like it became my new favorite color. And it's like, okay, this is amazing. And I know it's the work of the Lord. And there are a couple of things behind it. But I knew it's the work of the Lord. And if he can get me to love a color, or like a color, whichever way you want to look at it, that I saw before but never really saw the way I do now. He doesn't have to force two people to be in a relationship. The heart of a king is in the Lord's hand, and he can turn it whichever way he will. The Lord can make us fall for a person in a matter of speaking. So it doesn't have to force us. If we feel as if they're being forced, that's one of the work of the devil. He tries to force people to be together. Force people to get together, force people to get back together, or even force people to stay together. Potential another topic. And actually, if the enemy is involved with a prodigal spouse, and a prodigal spouse is with someone else, the enemy will try to get those two to stay together, even though it's not in accordance with the Lord's will. So this stuff, it can be very complex. So Jesus, even though Son, he learned obedience through things that he suffered. And likewise, if we don't do what the Lord's will is, we're going to suffer consequences. An example of that, Genesis 4. It was the Lord's will for Cain to rule over the sin that was crouching at his door. But Cain let the sin overcome him, and he killed his brother Abel. It wasn't the Lord's will for Cain to kill Abel. It was the Lord's will for Cain to rule over the sin that was crouching at his door. So sometimes, I'll just say, we learn lessons. The Lord didn't necessarily want to teach us that way. But if we oppose his will, then we're going to suffer consequences. He is sovereign. So a prodigal spouse will learn lessons. And as a result of a person being a prodigal spouse, it may cause some hurt to you. Maybe you have to see that person, or have seen a person, with someone else. The person may come across as if he or she is happier with the person than he or she would have ever been with you, or were with you. So there's different things that can happen as a result of a person being a prodigal. And even if you don't bear witness to what a person is going through or has gone through, Romans 8:28 through 30. Truly all things work together for the good for those who love the Lord and have been called according to his purpose. Because sometimes a person, or even you'd have gone through stuff with that person if he or she was not a prodigal. And those things would have been painful. But even though you don't go through together, you go through things separately, and it does make you stronger in the end. So a prodigal spouse could be someone you're in a relationship with, and the person runs off like Gomer, Hosea's wife. Or the person is taken captive, like Sarah, by the Pharaoh of Egypt, Genesis 12, or King Abimelech, Genesis 20. Or maybe someone else got into the picture and temporarily blocked God's will. Kind of like in Genesis 29, how Leah, I'll just say through witchcraft, ended up marrying Jacob instead of Jacob marrying his beloved Rachel. Those things do happen. Sometimes the other person knows what God's will is, and they willingly choose to be like Jonah, to do the opposite of what the Lord said, or something contrary to the Lord's will. Maybe they're like Saul. They knew what the Lord said, but they're in hiding. One of those things you don't have to go searching for the person. The Lord said that Saul was hiding among the stuff. He knew where he was. Then there's another prodigal, where David had to run and leave Michal, his wife. She was Saul's daughter. But King Saul was trying to kill David. David left, in a sense he was a prodigal. But that wasn't his will. And it would probably been worse if he had taken Michal with him. But in the end, and even Saul gave Michal to someone else, Phalti or Phaltiel. But in the end, David demanded to have his wife back because he had paid the price for her. And they did get back together. So for a while, David was a prodigal. He didn't want to be, but he fled for his life because Saul was on a murderous rampage. And a part of Saul's issue was that there was a devil who was tormenting him. I've said a lot, but these are just some of the nuances of a prodigal spouse. Now there's this. In 2 Kings 11, Athaliah became queen over Israel. She killed the king's remaining seed, except one, Joash. But Joash was kept safe by God's grace. And when Joash, a young man, less than 10 years old, was made king, Athaliah cried, "Treason, treason." But it wasn't treason, it was actually justice. She made herself queen by trying to kill God's will. But the Lord had a successor. So when she was crying out, "Treason, treason," it was actually justice. And there's some people, they will have done something like Leah. And when justice is served, when the person is in a sense ripped from his or her hand, that they'll say this was unfair. And they may say, that is my prodigal spouse, or that is someone the Lord has said I'm supposed to marry, and they may bring up those kind of allegations. And each will test the spirit to know if that person is truly speaking on behalf of the Lord. Leah got into a position, and in so many ways over the years, Jacob clearly demonstrated his love for Leah, to include the way he treated his firstborn son with Rachel. Joseph, who was actually his 11th-born son, he treated Joseph like he was a firstborn. So there are many things that Jacob did to clearly demonstrate his love for Rachel. In Genesis 30, there was a feud, one of many, between Leah and Rachel. And Leah had the nerve to accuse Rachel of trying to steal her husband. Let that sink in for a second. In Genesis 20, it was Leah, yes, under the direction of her father, who stole Rachel's husband. The man she was betrothed to, engaged to for 7 years. But in Genesis 30, years later, she was accusing Rachel of trying to steal her husband. Watch out for those. Because some people say, oh, so-and-so's a prodigal, but a person is not. In such case, it's actually an example of rebellion. In 1 Chronicles 28 and 29, David had announced to the entire kingdom, per the word of the Lord through Nathan the prophet, that the Lord had chosen Solomon to replace him as king. When David was on his deathbed, David's eldest surviving son, Adonijah, propped himself up to be king, had people made a proclamation about him being king. And it seemed as if he was king for a while. But Nathan brought up to Bathsheba. They went to the king. And David made Solomon king instead. Adonijah went to Bathsheba a little bit later. And he even confessed out of his own mouth that he knew it was the Lord's will for Solomon to be king. Yet, he still complained that he was king and about how the people knew it. And then he tried to backdoor Solomon so that he could become king instead, even though he knew what the Lord's will is. Again, this is a message to cover many aspects, not just one-sided, because some people are deceptive, some people are deceived, and the truth will prevail. With Adonijah, because he wouldn't quit, he paid with his life. But like Athaliah, who was crying treason, treason, when Joash was made king, the rightful king, the rightful heir of the king. When Joash was made king, Athaliah viewed it as treasonous because she was going to get unseated. And not when she unseated, she was executed that day. Likewise for Adonijah. He propped himself up to be king. He propped himself up to be king. He knew what the Lord's will is for Solomon to replace David as king. And when justice was done, he made it seem as if he was done wrong. And he tried again to unseat Solomon. But he confessed that he knew it was the Lord's will for Solomon to be king. And he was also executed. So the person who inquired about prodigal spouse, and even to the one who was like, I don't believe in that stuff anymore because of deception. Deception only lasts for so long, but then the truth comes out. So I pray this message has been a blessing to you. If you're one who has stolen someone else and it's time to give the person up, it's best to do so peacefully. It's best to retreat. If it results in any kind of embarrassment for you, hey, embarrassment is temporary. People may remember it 50 years from now. But no one's worth going to hell to, or with, or for. So if you're with someone, and especially if you know that you did some kind of illegal activity, some kind of illegal maneuver to get that person, if that person is ordained by God to be someone else, a time will come where you'll have to unhand that person one way or another. And I tell you, God doesn't change. God does not change. So the same God who told Sarah that she was going to give birth to the promised child within a year, when someone else took her into his harem, he told that man he's good as dead if he doesn't return the man's wife. The Lord watches over his words. So if you're someone, and especially if you know that you effectively stole someone else, and you've been told to release that person, please do. Do not become like the Pharaoh of Egypt in Exodus 14, who refused to let the children of Israel go, and he paid dearly. On top of everything else, he was paid. And even with all the plagues that hit Egypt, he was told after the third plague that this is the hand of God. When his own sorcerers told him that, he should have realized that God was against him, but he kept on fighting against God. And that is a losing battle. So if you're someone, and the Lord told you you're supposed to marry someone, believe the word of God. If you're the prodigal, recognize when God's hand is against you. Things may go well for a while. And there are times you have to cry out to the Lord, no matter what kind of position you're in. And you may not even be in a relationship with someone else. Maybe you just feel like you're Jonah in the bottom of the pit, and you cry to the Lord. But you can expect him to tell you to do the thing he commanded you to do before you went astray. Do not be like the concubine in Judges 19 who runs away, because even with her running away just to go to be at her father's house, it ended up costing her her life. So again, I pray this message blesses many. It comes from many points of view. Maybe we didn't touch everything, or touch everything in detail. But if the Lord promised you someone, he's watching over his words. And in due time, he will do as he's promised. But if you're waiting on deception in your heart, and you're trying to do things to make things happen, as Gamaliel told the Sanhedrin in Acts 5, but if the work is of men, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will find yourself fighting against God. I don't know about you, but I don't want to try to fight against God. The Lord is truly a man of his word. Jesus is the word, and the Holy Spirit brings things to pass. So I pray this message blesses you. God bless you, and Jesus Christ is Lord.